of this trimester, the second 4-month period of 2017, for those of you who needed some help with the math, the theme of this trimester is extreme ownership, all in for life and calling. Now, if you're new to us, we learned a long time ago that we can best stimulate spiritual growth, transformative spiritual growth, when we take a topic, a theme, an idea, a doctrine in some cases, and we hammer away at it over 4 months in a variety of ways. We teach about it, we talk about it in life groups, we have daily devotionals, and so on. And so it's always really important to us when 3 times a year we introduce a new spiritual growth theme. So the spiritual growth theme for this trimester is extreme ownership, all in for life and calling. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then today we'll launch a series that is connected to this bigger idea called Get Tough, Gritty Life, Gritty Faith. All right, so what do we mean by extreme ownership? Well, in brief, extreme ownership is a mindset and practice where we accept responsibility for everything in our domain. I was inspired with that particular idea when I began reading a book called Extreme Ownership that was written by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. Jocko and Leif served as U.S. Navy SEAL officers in SEAL Task Unit Bruiser through the Battle of Ramadi, some of the toughest urban combat in the history of the SEAL teams. Their task unit remains the most highly decorated special operations unit from the war in Iraq. And after returning from Iraq, these 2 guys built and led Navy SEAL leadership training for the next generation of SEALs, and then they took those lessons and started a leadership consulting firm called Echelon Front that teaches others how to build and lead their own high-performance winning teams. All right? I was influenced by that in terms of this trimester, by this book, and also, as I'll get into more later, more influenced by Paul's writings to 2 young pastors in the New Testament called Timothy and Titus. We'll get to that in a few moments. First, let's just talk about this book and this concept for a second. You're probably familiar with the book. It's a big New York Times bestseller, but let me just kind of give you a taste of this concept. So, early in the book, Jocko Willink tells the story about how he was the commander on a mission in the battle for Ramadi that went terribly wrong. All kinds of bad things happened. Particularly, there was a friendly fire incident where a couple of Iraqi soldiers, partners of ours there, were killed, and some of our U.S. SEALs were injured. They came back to do a debrief and to launch an investigation of what went wrong. And I'm just going to read to you a little bit from what Jocko says about this. He said, "I assembled the list of everything that everyone had done wrong. The list of mistakes was substantial, but something was missing. There was some problem, some piece that I hadn't identified, and it made me feel like the truth wasn't coming out. Who was to blame? Then it hit me. Despite all the failures of individuals, units, and leaders, and despite the myriad mistakes that had been made, there was only one person to blame for everything that had gone wrong on the operation. Brought the group together. I stood before the group," he writes. "Whose fault was this? The SEAL who had mistakenly engaged the Iraqi soldiers spoke up. It was my fault. I should have positively identified my target. No, I responded, it wasn't your fault. It was my fault, said the radio man from the sniper element. I should have passed our position sooner. Wrong, I responded. It wasn't your fault. It was my fault, said another SEAL who was a combat advisor with the Iraqi Army clearance team. I should have controlled the Iraqis and made sure they stayed in their sector. Negative, I said, you are not to blame. More of my SEALs were ready to explain what they had done wrong, but I had heard enough. You know whose fault this is? You know who gets all the blame for this? The entire group sat there in silence, the investigating officer as well. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, there is only one person to blame for this, me. I am the commander. I am responsible for the entire operation. As the senior man, I am responsible for every action that takes place on the battlefield. There is no one to blame but me. And I will tell you right now, I will make sure that nothing like this ever happens to us again. It was a heavy burden to bear, but it was absolutely true. I was the leader, I was in charge, and I was responsible. Thus, I had to take ownership of everything that went wrong. And then he shares later the principle that really guides this concept when he wrote, on any team, in any organization, all responsibility for success and failure rests with the leader. The leader must own everything in his or her world. Now, those of you who are leading things just said, shoot. And by the way, this applies to everybody except lead pastors, but that's a subject for another day. Those of you who may not be leading something, at least explicitly, may have just said, well, thank goodness, now I know who to blame. I'll always blame the leader. Well, later in the book, they tell the story of a CEO who was brought now their firm in to consult with a group of managers who were not performing at a very high level. And these managers particularly didn't understand or agree with the CEO's decisions about a particular project. And there was quite a conflict that was going on. Well, Jocko stands in front of this group of managers and says, let me ask you a question. Who is to blame for the CEO not explaining this to you in more detail? They knew the answer and nodded as they acknowledged the topic that I had covered in detail earlier. That's right, I said, you. That is what extreme ownership is all about. If you don't understand or believe in the decisions coming down from your leadership, it is up to you to ask questions until you understand how and why those decisions are being made. But the boss should have explained this to us, right? One manager asked. Absolutely. But she's not a mind reader. The CEO can't predict what you won't get or understand. She's not perfect. None of us are. And then he writes, leadership isn't one person leading a team. It's a group of leaders working together up and down the chain of command to lead. So one of these managers asked, we let the boss down when we didn't ask questions and communicate with her. To which he replied, yes, you did. It takes courage to go to the CEO's office and knock on her door and explain that you don't understand the strategy behind her decisions. The point is that everyone, every leader, every person in an organization is responsible for everything in their domain. And if they're really a great leader, they accept responsibility even for the actions of others. Imagine a work environment where everyone saw themselves responsible for their own stuff, where a leader said, if they didn't do a good job, it must be because I didn't do a very good job leading them, where an employee said, if I don't understand the vision, the strategy, or the tactics, it must be because I didn't ask the right questions until I understood this, so I could perform at a higher level. What if every husband held himself accountable for whatever was wrong in the marriage and showed their acceptance of ownership by taking steps to change himself and to ensure a great marriage? What if every wife felt the same way? What if each party in a friendship where something had gone wrong owned the problem and resolved that they would take actions to bring reconciliation? What if every team leader and every team member in this church was practicing extreme ownership? I think you can easily see how this mindset and the practices that flow from it could bring radical change all around us. Now, with this in mind, that broad idea in mind, know that over the next several months, if you'll hang in here with me, I hope to help each one of us become extreme owners of everything in our lives, and especially everything concerning the God callings that are on our lives. Now, there's a delicate balance here that must be negotiated, as we acknowledge that our life and callings come from God, that He is, in the great, true, and cosmic sense, sovereign and owner of everything, including everything in our lives and ourselves. But this doesn't absolve us of responsibility. We are called in Scripture to take hold of the life that He's given us, to act to fulfill our calling. We are held accountable for what we do with what God has given us. As followers of Jesus, we are responsible for ourselves and morally obligated to serve others. In this sense, we must own our life and calling. Now, Jesus is the supreme example of extreme ownership. There's a glorious passage in the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament where the writer describes how God accepted responsibility for everyone in this fallen world. Hebrews chapter 2 says it like this: by God's grace, Jesus tasted death for everyone. God, for whom and through whom everything was made, chose to bring many children into glory, meaning that God was not satisfied to leave us here in our lostness, but He decided to take action to bring us back into His family, all right? God, for whom and through whom everything was made, chose to bring many children into glory, and it was only right that He should make Jesus, through His suffering, and I love this language, a perfect leader, fit to bring them into their salvation. So now Jesus and the ones He makes holy have the same Father. So God, deciding to take action to fix what was wrong in this world and to bring people who were separated from him back into His family, decided through Jesus that He would be the perfect leader and that He would go first in doing what needed to be done for redemption, including tasting death for everyone, taking responsibility, if you please, for our mistakes. The New King James Version says it like this: for it was fitting for Him, for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation. Now, the New Living Translation says that He was a perfect leader. The New King James Version uses the word captain. He made the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. In other words, Jesus, the perfect leader, or the captain, or some translations say the pioneer or the author. Jesus, the perfect leader, had to suffer in order to accept responsibility for all of us, in order to get done what needed to be done to effect reconciliation between God and humanity. See, God not only owned humanity's condition, but He sent Jesus to become the captain of our salvation, to taste death for all of us, to say, I'll go first. I'll pay the price that all of you owe God. This is extreme ownership. The night before D-Day, the night before 3 million Allied troops stormed the beaches at Normandy and other places to confront Hitler's wall there in the Atlantic. The night before that happened, Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander, sat down and wrote a letter. He wrote a letter that was to be delivered to the White House in the event that attack the next day failed. And this is what he wrote. He wrote, "Our landings have failed. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches itself to the attempt, it was mine alone." In other words, he says, anticipating the possibility that this will not work, I accept responsibility. Now see, this is a rare and courageous quality in a leader. This is a rare and courageous quality in any individual because we live in a world today where people seem to enjoy being victims of other people's actions. We live in a world today where people seem to want to blame somebody somewhere else for whatever is wrong in their lives. Well, an extreme owner is not that kind of person. Get this. They accept responsibility not just for their own stuff, but they accept responsibility for stuff that they didn't even do. See, this is the kind of leader that Jesus is. Jesus, before humanity even made the fatal mistake in the beginning, was the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. In other words, he was prepared to pay the penalty for other people's sins even before they sinned. This is ownership. Imagine if we lived in a world where everybody was thinking that way. See, I'm going to challenge us to practice extreme ownership in every domain of life. We are not victims. We are owners. We accept responsibility for ourselves. We accept the moral obligation to serve the world around us. We are leaders. We look at the mess in the world around us and we ask, what have I done? What should I do? What can I do? We do not blame the people around us. We do not blame our upbringing. We do not blame political leaders. We do not blame anybody. We see ourselves as a responsible party and we lead. We go first. So, that's a teaser on the concept of extreme ownership. So now let's talk for a little while about this series that we're actually starting today. Some of you are saying it's about time that he got to what we're talking about today. And this series is called Get Tough, Gritty Life, Gritty Faith, and here's the basic thesis in relationship to extreme ownership. It's this: if we're going to practice the kind of extreme ownership that I'm suggesting today, that Jesus modeled, that great leaders practice, if we're going to practice this kind of extreme ownership, we're going to have to get tough. We're going to have to get tough. Now, there are two recommended readings for this trimester. One is the book Extreme Ownership. The second, and most importantly to me, are Paul's letters to two young pastors in the New Testament. And these letters are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And we're going to lead people through these letters in our daily devotionals over the next 4 months. It's going to kind of be a deep dive into Paul's letters to Timothy and Titus. And my particular focus over the next few weeks, because I have a certain fascination with this, is Paul's writings to Timothy in particular. And how that Paul challenges Timothy to get tough. How he challenges Timothy to own his life and calling. And this is what I mean. Timothy was a young man with great potential, but he needed to get tough in order to realize it. So who was Timothy? And let me just ask you guys a question. Is everybody doing okay today? Everybody's fine? All right. Everybody's awake? All right. Remember not to make too much noise because somebody close to you is sleeping. All right. Timothy was a young man chosen by the Apostle Paul as a protege and ministry partner. He was from a small town in Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, called Lystra. His father was Greek, a Gentile. His mother was a Jewish follower of Jesus. Timothy was about 19 years old when Paul saw something special in him and called him out. And that story is told in the history of the early Christian church, Acts chapter 16. In his first season of ministry, Timothy traveled with the great apostle Paul until he was about 30 years old. Paul's traveling around quite a large part of the world, establishing Christian churches in the first century. These are the first Christian churches that were ever established. And Timothy, this young man, is traveling with Paul. Then, when Timothy was about 30 years old, Paul gave him an extremely difficult assignment. He asked him, actually, he commanded him to stay in Ephesus, where Paul had started a church. He asked him to stay in Ephesus to deal with a very significant problem. And the problem was that there was a group of false teachers who had risen up, who were teaching doctrines that were not in line with the teachings of Jesus and the early apostles. They weren't Christian, if you please. And these teachings were leading a lot of people astray and doing tremendous damage to people for all kinds of reasons that we won't get into right now. But Paul had to go on. He went to Macedonia and left this 30-year-old man in Ephesus to confront these false teachers and also to raise up new leaders once these guys were dealt with, deacons, elders, and to stabilize that young Christian church. This was a very pivotal moment in the history of early Christianity. Ephesus was a large metropolis and a very important city in relationship to the way the Christian church was growing in the world at that time. There was just one big problem, and that is that Timothy did not want to stay. Timothy felt overwhelmed by this responsibility, and he wanted to go with Paul, but Paul, it's very clear, commanded him to stay. So after Paul leaves, he writes this letter back to Timothy. He writes a couple letters back to Timothy, but in the first letter, this is what he says at the very opening. This is 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 1. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the command of God our Savior and of Christ Jesus our hope, to Timothy, my true son in the faith. As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain persons not to teach false doctrines any longer. Now again, notice the language. Why is Paul having to urge Timothy to stay in Ephesus? Because it seems from this and a variety of other passages, Timothy didn't want to be there. He wanted out. Later in this chapter, Paul digs in a little deeper. He says, Timothy, my son, 1 Timothy 1:18, I am giving you this command in keeping with the prophecies once made about you, so that by recalling them, you may fight the battle well. Notice that passage, three things that I'll just talk about for a moment. First of all, he tells Timothy that he was commanded to stay there. Secondly, he told him to stay there, keeping in mind prophecies that had been made about him. And thirdly, the nature of his work there was going to be a fight. The English Standard Version has that text like this. This charge I entrust to you, Timothy, my child, in accordance with the prophecies previously made about you, so that by them you may wage the good warfare. I command you, stay there, think about the prophecies, and fight this battle that needs to be fought. Paul reminds him here, while he commands him to stay, that Timothy should be expecting to have success in the work that he's being called to do there. God never calls anybody to do anything where there shouldn't be an expectation of success. And Timothy here alludes to something he alludes to several other places in his writings to Timothy. Paul alludes to several things he alludes to in his other writings to Timothy, which is that there had been prophecies made about him. Now, we don't know for sure what these prophecies were because we're never told in specificity. But what we do know is that in the New Testament, prophecies were given for the edification of the person who was being prophesied to. The nature of prophecy and the office of the prophet in the Old Testament is changed in some important ways as we come into the New Testament. And the important change is that we're taught that prophecy was to be used for people's edification. You understand what edification means? It's to build them up. It's to make them feel good about what they're supposed to do. It's to speak positive words over them about God's plan on them. So even though we don't know exactly what these prophecies were, we could assume that it was somebody speaking to Timothy, feeling inspired by God to do so, and saying essentially this: hey, Timothy, you're a special man in God's eyes. Hey, Timothy, even though you're young, that's okay, because God's got a plan for your life. Hey, Timothy, you're going to have some struggles to go through in your life, but that's okay, because if you'll hang in there and if you're going to fight hard, you're going to get through it. Do you understand? So Paul says, Timothy, I'm commanding you to stay there in this tough place, but remember the things that God has said about who you are and what you're supposed to do and how you're going to be able to do them. And Timothy, with all that in mind, fight the good fight. Now, it's interesting that Paul evokes the imagery of warfare. As New Testament scholar Walter Liefeld writes, Christian ministry is more than proclamation, it is combat. The reality is that we're sitting here in this place 2,000 years after the founding of Christianity because numbers of courageous people have fought and sacrificed and suffered and struggled and led for us to be able to be here. And we'll talk more about this in coming weeks, about the kind of courage that people of faith need to have to fight for what's right in this world. But you know that it's more than just Christian ministry that's a fight. You know that anything good that God's called you to in your life is a fight as well. And I assume from my long experience talking with people about a lot of things in their lives, that if there's anything good in your life, anything that's worthy, some point it's felt like a fight in order to have that thing. You fight for your marriage. You probably fight sometimes in your marriage too, but you fight for your marriage. You start a business and you fight for the success of that business. You fight for your kids' lives at many times during their upbringing and their young adulthood, and in some ways it never gets any easier, those of you with young kids. There's a certain something in us we're fighting for the things that are important for us. And Paul tells Timothy that he needs to wage a good warfare. Now, it wasn't in Timothy's natural disposition to be a fighter, but Paul evokes this imagery of somebody who's going to go to war for something. Several weeks ago, I read Stephen Pressfield's wonderful historical fiction novel about Alexander the Great. Stephen Pressfield's an incredible writer, and I enjoyed interacting with Alexander the Great from his perspective. And though Alexander the Great predated the first century where Paul's writing this stuff to Timothy, Alexander and his armies and the Roman legions that ultimately followed painted a picture of what warfare was like. What I'm trying to say is that when someone talked about war, when someone talked about fighting, when someone talked about soldiering, there was a particular kind of image that came into people's minds during this time in history. This was the time of the Roman legions. People were very aware of war as history was seesawing back and forth between these conflicting forces over several hundred years. And one of the things that I read in Pressfield's writing about Alexander the Great is how proud Alexander's father, Philip of Macedonia, was when Alexander received his first wound in battle. Now, this is so different than how people think in today's world, and I'm not saying what's right or what's wrong. I'm just going to tell you, here's what Alexander says. He said, I never saw him, his dad, so proud as when I showed him my first wound, a lance thrust through my left shoulder. Does it hurt? He bawled, not crying, he's shouting. Does it hurt? He bawled, spurring up in the flush of victory. And when I answered yes, he roared, good, it's supposed to. Then turning to the officers and soldiers round about, he said, my son's wound is in front where it should be. And then Alexander says, my father loved me. Now, this is in a time when when somebody slides into second base and scratches their knee, we shut the game down and take them to the emergency room, right? But this was a different era in which Timothy was living in, this idea of warfare, this idea of it's like Paul is saying to Timothy, and again, I just restate what Philip said. He said, "Son, did your wound hurt?" He said, "Yes." And Philip said, "Good, it's supposed to hurt." In other words, you're a warrior. And then he says to the guys around him, "Look, my son's wound is in front." In other words, he wasn't running. It's not in back. It's in front. In other words, he says, "I want you to look at my son, Alexander. He's growing up to be a man and he's going to be a warrior." That's the kind of thing that Paul's trying to say to Timothy here. He's saying, Timothy, be a warrior. Man up. Take your shots. You're going to get hurt. Rub some dirt on it. Get up. We're in a war here. Let's go, Timothy. The problem is that Timothy was not naturally given to toughness. Everything that we know about Timothy indicates that his natural disposition was one of timidity, anxiety, perhaps even personal cowardice. He seemed to be easily intimidated, easily discouraged, easily depressed. And there's a famous passage that sums this up. It's in Paul's second letter to Timothy, and in the first chapter where he wrote this. This is Paul to Timothy. He said, "Night and day I constantly remember you in my prayers, recalling your tears. I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy." In other words, Paul is referring to the fact that when he left Timothy in Ephesus, Timothy cried. "Recalling your tears, I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. I am reminded of your sincere faith." Again, Paul's calling out the good stuff in him. "I know there's good stuff in you, Timothy. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also. For this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you." The King James says, "Stir up the gift of God that is in you through the laying on of my hands, for the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline." So he says, Timothy, I realize that you're feeling fearful, but that feeling you have that won't let you stand up and fight for what you're supposed to fight for did not come from God, because God did not give you a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind or self-discipline. The Expositor's Greek Testament has part of that passage like this: "Timothy, your weak point is a deficiency in moral courage." That's a pretty hard thing to say, isn't it? But this is what Paul is saying to his favorite son in the faith. He's calling him out. Timothy, your weak point is deficiency in moral courage. You get this image of Timothy crying when Paul left him in Ephesus. And that's okay. Strong men, of course, cry for appropriate reasons. If we're not capable of crying, our strength should be questioned, perhaps. We cry, though, for appropriate reasons. But you get the sense that there's more going on here with Timothy. He was raised by his mom and grandmother. His dad evidently died when he was a young boy. It appears that Paul is new to his life in terms of being this strong male role model. Timothy comes from a small town. He was given to sickness that seemed to be anxiety-driven. That famous passage in 1 Timothy 5:23 where Paul said, "Stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses." Timothy was also very concerned about his youth. Paul said to him in 1 Timothy 4:12, "Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young." Paul was also very concerned and protective of Timothy when he visited other places to do hard work. He wrote to the Corinthians one time when Timothy was going to go represent him. He said, when Timothy comes, see to it that he has nothing to fear while he is with you. Why is Paul concerned about Timothy being afraid when he goes to Corinth? Because Timothy had a problem with being afraid. When Timothy comes, see to it that he has nothing to fear while he is with you, for he is carrying on the work of the Lord just as I am. No one then should treat him with contempt. Send him on his way in peace so that he may return to me. And then you learn as you read Paul's letters to Timothy as well, that Paul was being held in prison because of his teaching of the Christian gospel, and Timothy seems to be afraid to visit Paul in prison. For whatever reason, he seems to be ashamed of the fact that Paul is there. This is the guy that Paul is saying, hey, Timothy, this isn't who you are. This isn't who God said you are. Timothy, there were tremendous prophecies made over you. God said you can do this. Timothy, the Holy Spirit is in you, and the Holy Spirit has given you the gifts necessary to do this thing. Timothy, you have the power to do what God has entrusted to your care. You have the love necessary to exercise that power properly. You have the self-discipline, Timothy. I know you don't see it. I know you don't feel it. I know you don't feel strong, but there's good stuff in you, Timothy. Come on, Timothy. I command you, stay there. Remember what God said about you. Get ready to fight a good fight. Come on, Timothy. Stir up the gift that's in you. Fan the flame. Don't give in to your natural weaknesses. Own this thing, Timothy. Get tough. Own your life and calling. See, we all have places in our lives where we're given to some natural weakness. Every one of us, I'm assuming, has some area in our life that if it doesn't get strong, it's going to keep us from living fully God's dreams for our lives. It can be a breach in a relationship. It can be a problem with fear. It can be something happening in our finances. It could be a business that for some reason we're not really owning it in the way that we should and bringing it to success. All of us have something in our lives. It could be what's going on in our physical body. It could be the way that we're eating. It could be all kinds of things. A habit, an addiction, a temptation that if we give in to whatever that weak thing is, it will keep us from waging the war for success in our calling that God's called us to. So let me start wrapping this up by telling you a story about me. My natural disposition, and this will surprise those of you who know me, but my natural disposition is given to anxiety, to worrying about things. And the reason that it would surprise people who know me is because rarely is this manifest in the season of life that I am in and have been for many years. And the reason that it's rarely manifest is because I had, I think, an encounter with God many, many years ago where I just refused to live in fear and anxiety. I started traveling and preaching when I was very young. When I was about 18, this is going to surprise some of you who are bored out of your mind right now, but when I was at about 18, I started getting calls from youth ministries and churches to come and speak for them, and by the time I was 18, I was booked like 50 weeks a year. And the presbyters who I was in submission to said, you have a gift, we'll work on your education as you're moving forward, see what happens. Well, this is why at 19 years old, I found myself preaching in a place called Texarkana, Arkansas. Has anybody here ever been to Texarkana, Arkansas? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Anyway, I'm preaching in this church in Texarkana, Arkansas. I think that the whole town is centered around like a Waffle House or something. But in Texarkana, Arkansas, I'm preaching at this church, and they have a guest quarters for their guest speakers. And this guest quarters was they had a regular church building, and detached from the regular church building, out in the middle of the woods, literally, they'd build an ancillary building, and it had a small basketball gym in it and some classrooms and a room where guests would stay when they were speaking for them. I would always have preferred a hotel, but anyway. So I'm there alone, and I'm there alone. If I remember right, I was speaking every night on a Wednesday through a Sunday night and Sunday morning, and I'm there alone all day. The only time I see any people is at night when the services are happening, and it's in the woods. It's pitch dark. Literally at night, I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. When I would walk into the area where I was staying, there was a little kitchen attached to it, and truly, it was like the fellowship hall kitchen. Truly, I would turn the light on, and hundreds, no exaggeration, if not thousands of cockroaches that had covered the floor would disappear into God only knows where. Just boom, boom, there all these cockroaches went. So I shared my room with at least one lizard. I couldn't tell if there were multiple. I only saw one at a time. I saw the largest spider I've ever personally encountered in my life in that room. I'm getting somewhere with this. The largest spider I've ever seen. The body of that spider is probably this big around. Not spiders. I guess the lizards maybe were eating all the other spiders, but this spider was probably going to eat the lizard. I mean, it was amazing. There wasn't a television in the room. There was no cell phones in those days. I know I'm dating myself here. No email. Long distance was incredibly expensive. The bottom line is I was by myself in this place. And I was lonely and discouraged and full of self-doubt and wondering about my calling, and am I supposed to be doing this, and is it worth it, and do I want to do this the rest of my life? And then to top the whole thing off, I mean, I was in a very dark place. I was dating a really gorgeous girl. Her name was Sharon Deck. And Sharon Deck and I, for the only time in our now 35-year relationship, broke up while I was there in that place. I know you're feeling bad at her right now. You're thinking, why would you break up with him when he was in a place like that? She's standing back there. It's a good question. Ask her later. Bottom line is, just get this picture. I am a mess. I got up and preached a sermon, and I was very teary-eyed in the sermon. This is like the day after Sharon and I broke up. I'm very teary-eyed in the sermon and passionate, and the pastor says to me later, he says, you know, that was amazing. You were so emotional. You were so passionate. The people could really feel it. Well, what he didn't know is I was about to have an emotional breakdown, okay? Seriously. Well, one day I'm wandering around in this place, and I go back in a classroom, and on a bookshelf back in a classroom is a book by Norman Vincent Peale called The Power of Positive Thinking. And I make sure there aren't any cockroaches immediately in that area, and I take the book off the shelf, and I sit down on the floor on that, and I start reading the classic, which I'd never read before, Norman Vincent Peale. And, you know, for instance, you know, the opening page says this: "It is appalling to realize the number of pathetic people." You wouldn't even be allowed to say that anymore, right? "It is appalling to realize the number of pathetic people who are hampered and made miserable by the malady popularly called the inferiority complex. But you need not suffer from this trouble. When proper steps are taken, it can be overcome. You can develop creative faith in yourself, faith that is justified. I found the solution of this problem in the simple techniques of faith taught in the Bible. The greatest secret for eliminating the inferiority complex, which is another term for, and this is what a lot of what I was suffering, deep and profound self-doubt, is to fill your mind to overflowing with faith. Develop a tremendous faith in God, and that will give you a humble yet soundly realistic faith in yourself. And at that moment, in a way I don't know how to convey, I all of a sudden realized that I did not have to feel the way I was feeling. And I all of a sudden realized that in spite of my circumstances, I could believe what I knew God had said about my life and what I knew He said in His Word about me, and that I could think about that in a way that affected my feelings. And I decided at that moment to own my anxiety, that natural place of weakness in me, that somehow I knew if I didn't get a hold of that, I would not be able to live the life that God had dreamed for me or fulfill the callings He had given me. And I decided right there in that room, if you please, to stir up the gift of God that was in me, because I knew that God had not given me a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. Now look, that's my story. Everybody here has a story. And some of you are saying, I've been coming to church here 20 years and I've never heard that story. I don't particularly like telling that story. But the reality is, if I wouldn't have sat there in that yucky classroom and decided that in spite of my circumstance, I was going to overcome that and live according to what God said, not all the other fear and anxiety and doubt and all that I was feeling. The truth is, we wouldn't be sitting here in this room today. That's just the truth. Because I would never have been able to dream and imagine and struggle and sacrifice. And by the way, of course, if Sharon and I wouldn't have made up, we wouldn't be sitting here either 35 years later. But each of us have to come to a place in our lives where we look at some area of weakness that we know is debilitating, and we have to get tough. We have to decide that we are not going to let that thing destroy us. We have to decide that we're going to kindle the flame, stir up the gift, believe what God says, so that we can rise to live the life and fulfill the calling that God has given us. Would you stand with me, please, and I'll wrap up our time. Now, I hope that you'll receive what I've said today in all of its kind of rambling ways. I hope that you'll receive it as an introduction to something that I hope in a variety of ways in coming weeks and months we dig into. And one thing that we're encouraging over the next 7 weeks, this series is going to go from now through Father's Day. I believe that's 7 weeks. We're introducing what we're calling a Get Tough Challenge. And the Get Tough Challenge is detailed in a seat pocket close to you. You'll see, thank you, Chilla, you'll see a card like this. I'm not asking anything of you except to pick it out and look at it. Some of you are, get tough. Reach into the seat pocket. Pull out the card. If you're on a front row, there's one in a seat pocket around you. Maybe folks on the second row can help folks who are in the front. But the Get Tough Challenge is where every week we're going to encourage all of us to get tough in some area of our lives. Now, this is going to involve a variety of things. So let's say, so for instance, and I really don't have time to get into this morning, but I tease you with this thought, and I hope to teach about this in 2 weeks. Everything that we study, so Paul said to Timothy that God didn't give us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-discipline. What is understood to be generally true is that when we practice self-discipline in one area of our life, more than likely, it's easier to experience self-discipline in other areas of our lives. So if we're getting up at an early hour, that seems to affect people's diets. So nonetheless, because of this idea, we're going to hopefully have some fun with this thing of getting tough in one area that maybe seem totally unrelated to whatever the specific weak part is. Now, obviously, that needs to be addressed, because when we keep getting tough here, there, and everywhere, it bleeds over into every area of our lives where we become these warrior kind of people. We want to become tough people who own the stuff in our lives, and who accept responsibility for the world around us, and who fight for things that are right, okay? So like this week, we're encouraging people to do something personally challenging, maybe something that you've been avoiding or putting off. So you can look at that and decide if you want to get involved in that, and we're encouraging people to share their journey, updates, photos, video clips, challenges, inspiration and you'll see the address here at the bottom, facebook.com/group/TLCC Get Tough. So like for instance, this week, and I'm going to try to be a leader in this, I've been putting off for some time taking my physical fitness to a higher level. And I've gotten kind of sloppy and I'm carrying more weight than I want to, and so on and so forth. And though I in my entire adult life, I'll work out 3 to 5 times a week, as faithful as can be, I've gotten stale in all of that. And my oldest son, who's a freak of nature physically, and who works out like, I don't know, a crazy man, he's been challenging me to go to a well-known MMA gym close to where I live and to sign up for a boxing class. And I've been saying, okay, I will, like some wimp. I will. And 2 weeks later, I'm embarrassed. Did you go, Dad? I will. I never say no. I always say I will. Well, so help me by God's grace, tomorrow I'm going to go join a boxing class, and I'm going to get tougher. And it's just, well, you say, what does that have to do with anything? Well, you could probably make the argument nothing, but I'm going to make the argument in coming weeks that it does have something to do something, because I'm going to practice self-discipline in an area of my life where I need to get tougher. You understand? And so we've all got all kinds of things in our lives. Like some of you need to get tough when it comes to sitting down and going through your budget, right? Because you've gotten sloppy, and when the money's not right, it affects everything else in your life, right? When your physical fitness isn't right, it affects everything else in your life, right? And so that's kind of the approach we're going to take. Paul told Timothy in one passage that he needed to go to the gym spiritually, because he said bodily exercise profits a little, but training in godliness bleeds over into everything in your life. Okay, so that's my invitation, my challenge to you.